Next, from Springfield, we talked to Phil Gonet, president of the Illinois Coal Association, about the effects of President Obama's intended coal reduction policy on the state's coal production and electricity costs. This runs about 20 minutes.
Phil Gonet, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And about a week or so ago, as we're taping this, the president came out with a plan that would require cutting carbon dioxide emissions into the air by some 32% over the next 15 years. What impact would that have on the Coal Association in Illinois?
Well, it's first of all, it's a negative impact on coal. Right now, there's not a way to reduce carbon emissions from power plants. The technology has not developed. Sadly, Future Gen, a near zero emission power plant, which was a private public partnership with the federal government that was supposed to prove this technology, coal burning zero emission power plant, that the federal government pulled the plug on that. So the technology doesn't exist.
Let me just, technology doesn't exist to
reduce carbon emissions from power plants. What Future Gen would have done, and there's still projects around the world that's going to prove this technology, but it's called carbon capture and storage. The only way you solve this is you capture it. You can use it for commercial purposes. You can use it for carbonation, and there are uses for CO2, but there's too much CO2 that's produced. So the plan is to store it underground forever, and that's what Future Gen was supposed to prove, that it is safe, it is reliable, and it can be done. So without that technology, the limits that the federal government are placing on carbon emissions can't be met, and that means these coal power plants are going to shut down. We believe it's going to create a shortage of electricity. When you have a shortage of any product and the demand stays the same or goes up, prices go up. So we think that this is going to harm the economy. It's going to harm poor people. They pay a disproportionate amount of their disposable income on energy. And here's the catch: it's going to have a negligible impact on carbon emissions worldwide. EPA has even admitted that's going to have less than a 2% impact reduction of CO2 emissions worldwide. And so we've kind of coined the term all pain, no gain, because it's going to cost American consumers, businesses and individuals more for electricity without any benefit at all.
Yeah, and I want to underscore for the viewers, I mean, they might listen to you and go, well, that's too bad for the coal miners. But they don't realize, I think, a lot of times how much of our electricity that we obviously all use is produced by coal. Do you know what the number is in Illinois and across the nation? What is the average use of coal to produce electricity?
Yeah, in Illinois it's about 45%. We're actually lower than a lot of states. In Indiana, right next door, they're about 98% coal. But because Illinois has the most nuclear power plants than any state in the country, nuclear energy is the majority share of electricity in Illinois, and that's about 46%. So coal and nuclear are about the same. And this leads me to the key point here, Terry, is that these are base load power sources. Base load means that they're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now, most power plants will shut down from 4 to 6 weeks per year for maintenance outage, just to make sure they don't have any forced outages when you really need them. But that's the key. They're base load power sources, and there are only three: coal, nuclear, and to a limited extent, natural gas. And people seem to think, well, we're just going to replace coal with renewables, windmills and solar, and that just won't work. Those renewable energy sources are intermittent. They're not reliable. They're only available about a third of the time, and on most days, like today, they're not available because the wind doesn't blow. So you need base load power to support that. That's why the coal industry has been consistent for the past 10 years in this. We need an energy policy that takes all of the above strategy and all of the above sources. I'm all for wind, I'm all for solar, but we've got to recognize that they're not reliable, they're not abundant, and they're not cheap. And that's what coal is.
And just to point out something that is so I mean, it sounds ridiculous when you say it, but obviously the sun doesn't shine all the time. So at nighttime, we're not going to have the sun, and the solar doesn't work at nighttime, and we're still going to be using electricity at night. And we really, as a society, don't have a good way to store electrical power. Is that right?
We have no way to store. I mean, we need a battery, and there are companies that are working on batteries that will be able to store enough energy, and maybe residential customers can do something like that. And there's some residential customers that have solar now, and if they have some battery capability or capacity, they can store some of that to be used when the sun doesn't shine. But that technology has to evolve as well, and maybe someday we will have a battery large enough. Look at the technological changes that are just made in our lifetime in terms of computers and computer chips and things like that. Maybe that's coming, that we can get a battery, the size of this room maybe, that can store enough energy that you can generate enough electricity, store it, and use it when you need it. But that technology doesn't exist either.
Yeah, and so that's the thing, as you say, the point is people could have a solar panel on their roof, they could have a car battery in their basement, they can power their lights at night, they can have a reading light. But when you put it in terms of running a industrial economy, which the United States is, and just imagine, among other things, trying to run a subway, you're not going to run a subway system on solar panels, and you're not going to run a steel mill, which have to have those pots melting steel, an enormous use of electricity. Or power, I should say. You just can't do that on solar panels and wind.
I think the steel mill is an excellent example, because that's a power user that needs the same amount of power 24 hours a day. And in the power plant industry, you love customers like that, because not unfortunately, but it's a fact that energy use changes during the day. So this power plant in Springfield is adjusting the amount of energy that's being used right now. And so if we have some big power source come on, they have to generate more electricity because it's made as it's needed. And so you look for a power need like a steel plant that's going to run, constant at one level. So you don't have to ramp your power plants up and down to meet the power need swings during the day. So yeah, it needs to be available 24 hours a day.
Do you know offhand how much of the electrical power used in Illinois is from wind and solar?
Right. I think I got to part of that. So the nuclear and coal are about the same, 45-46%, and the remainder is natural gas and renewables.
Which would be about 10%.
About 10%. I think wind power is probably about 5%, and that's increased quite a bit the last 10 years. It's gone from 1% though to 5%. And yet, in order to comply with this regulation, it would probably have to go to 20%. But do we have enough space to put those many windmills in to comply? So it's just, and they're also calling for energy efficiencies, and we've promoted energy efficiencies, or the state has promoted energy efficiencies, and that requires people to change their behavior. And people have more cell phones today and iPads and electric cars. The energy consumption still continues to go up despite all of the advances in energy efficiencies and getting people to use less.
I mean, that's something that people think about the Teslas and the electric cars, and they are coming out, and we did a story on them. Some are really becoming very effective as far as the miles they can go. But you have to be reminded that while they're not polluting themselves per se, I mean, they're not running on gasoline, they're using electricity that was powered by coal primarily.
Exactly. I've got a bumper sticker I can give you on the way out that says exactly that. That's just it. And then going back to the other question that I think you had, about 10 years ago, 50% of the country's energy came from coal. That slipped down to about 40%. And we've lost our market share mostly to natural gas, and that's due to natural gas being more abundant, a lot of it being made available through fracking. The Marcellus shale out east has proven to be a huge source for natural gas. So natural gas has come up. I think nuclear nationwide is about 20%, but coal is holding at about 40% as an average in the United States.
I'll tell the viewers who may not know, you're not just the head of the Coal Association. You would also in the past run the Illinois Municipal CWLP City Light and Water. In other words, the utility. So you're a former utility executive. Do you know what would the economic impact be if these proposals by the administration went into effect on electrical rates? Has anyone run the numbers of what? I know it's somewhat of a guess because you have to make some estimates. But for the average person, do we have any concept of what it might mean in their pocketbook?
Yeah, we had a study done for the coal industry, and of course that'll be assailed as being biased. EPA says the total impact per year is $8 billion, and our study says $400 billion. Now you break that down by states, and it can average anywhere from 15 to 40% increase in the cost of electricity for consumers depending on the states. What this plan does is assigns a carbon reduction for each state, because only the states, that's the other thing that most people don't understand. States have to file an implementation plan because only the federal government has already delegated to the states years ago the authority to work within the federal program to adjust whatever their plan is for their state individual needs. So, for example, in the proposed rule that came out last year, the proposed rule came out last June. They had a comment period that ended in December. EPA supposedly looked at all the comments. There were millions of comments, and they came out with a final rule 2 weeks ago. And Illinois was slated for a 30% reduction in carbon emissions last year, and that got boosted up to 32%. I don't know why, because I'm not sure. Well, it may be somewhere in the 1,500-page preamble of the rule that EPA issued to go along with this, but I haven't read the whole thing yet, and I don't know where it is in there that explains how they made changes in the targets for each state and how they have to reduce. But it just depends. I mean, in Illinois, getting away from city water, light, and power, that's a municipal utility. They have their challenges. They might be able to make some efficiencies in their boiler modifications to meet a reduction, but it depends on how that fits into the state plan. And one of the problems with the state plan, as I understand it, is that U.S. EPA has used a baseline year of, I think, 2012 to measure carbon emissions from that baseline, and energy use was lower that year than any of the last 5. If they had picked the year before or the year before, it would be different. So emissions were down, yet the penalty now is you have to reduce more. The other problem City Water, Light, and Power is going to run into is that they have a wind contract. They have the capability of 100 megawatts, 125 megawatts, I think, of wind power they can bring in. The wind farmers in Iowa. So Iowa gets the benefit, and CWLP gets no benefit, even though they were encouraged, to bring in wind power for their consumers, but they get no credit for that in this proposed plan. So there's some inequities in the plan, and it all depends on how the Illinois EPA is going to handle that in the state implementation plan. You're going to hear an acronym called a SIP, and that's a state implementation plan. Now there are many people, National Mining Association, some of our coal operators, and Senate President Mitch McConnell. McConnell sent a letter to every governor. He said, just say no. You're not going to file a state implementation plan. And so the Rauner administration has not made any comment other than last week a one-sentence comment that they were reviewing, that the issue was under review, but we have no idea where the Rauner administration is going to be on this issue. Some states like Indiana, Wisconsin, for some of the states that are around us, their governors have sent a letter to EPA saying, we're not going to send in a state implementation plan. We think this plan is harmful to the economy. It's also illegal. And that's where our approach is going to be. It's more of a litigation strategy to try to invalidate the law in the courts. I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen the legal analysis, and you've probably heard the term 111D. That's the section of the Clean Air Act that U.S. EPA is using as its authority to do this. Most of the lawyers that I've listened to say they've overstepped their bounds. They don't have the authority under 111D to order these kind of changes to take effect. So our response is pretty much going to be emphasized on the legal strategy and how can we invalidate the law that way.
And I would say, just in closing, so on one hand, it might be that before any of this can take effect, the Obama administration will be out of power. Then it would depend upon who follows as president and whether that administration would want to continue on with that policy and implement it or not. But for all the additional cost and change and pain that the American economy would suffer, and people will say, well, we're suffering from global warming or climate change or whatever phrase they want to use. What impact would any of these regulations have on other countries such as China and India?
Well, and that's another key consideration. I mean, it's no secret the president wanted this proposal to come out before the meeting in Paris on climate change. He wants to show the United States as a leader worldwide in an effort to convince some countries like China and India to follow suit. Well, guess what? They're not going to follow suit. You know, we have a 100-year advantage on those countries in terms of our standard of living because we had electricity. Our standard of living is the highest of any nation in the world, and China and India have seen what has done to our country, and they want that. And you know what? They deserve it. And so they're going to continue to develop, and the way they do it is through reliable, abundant, and cheap fuel source from coal for electricity. Plus, you've got 1.5 billion people in Africa that live without electricity. Their standard of living is what we had in this country 200 years ago. They live to age 30 maybe. They have unclean water. The standard of living is horrible. Those people deserve a better quality of life. And yet President Obama is putting pressure on the World Bank for them not to loan money to those countries to build coal-burning power plants. So he wants to keep them trapped in poverty and early death, and it's just wrong. To me, it's criminal to do something like that.
Well, and there's obviously an impact. In other words, things don't happen in a vacuum. When something happens, there is a domino effect of results. One might go back 10 years ago this summer to 1995, or 20 years ago, I guess we should say, this summer, where 500 people in Chicago, poor individuals who couldn't afford air conditioning, died of heat, the elderly, to say if we price electricity out of the pocketbooks of people to be able to afford things like running your air conditioner on a hot day, a younger person might just sweat, an older person, it can be fatal.
Oh, no, absolutely, and we think that's what this proposal, this rule is going to lead to, and you know, like I say, the challenge for us is can we make the arguments, the legal arguments to invalidate this. We did get some good news from the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a prior rule that took effect in April called the Mercury and Air Toxics Standards Rule, which is going to require power plants to reduce further their emissions, and it focuses on mercury. And it was challenged in the courts and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the big question there was that EPA ignored the cost of that rule and what it would have on consumers. And the U.S. Supreme Court, it was a split vote, 5-4, but they remanded it back to EPA and said, you didn't consider the cost. And what EPA basically, their position in this was, well, the cost doesn't matter because of the greater good it's going to do to get these pollutants out of the air. And the court says, no. It's gotta, you have to show the analysis that fiscally this makes sense. We think we can apply the same standard in the Clean Power Plan, or what I'm calling the costly power plan, because you know they have not looked at the cost. And again, getting back to the other kind of a phrase I throw out there, all pain and no gain. Remember that even EPA admits this will have a less than a 2% reduction on carbon emissions worldwide. I mean, what's the point? And all pain, no gain.
All right, Phil Gonet, we appreciate your time.
You're welcome.